Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're embarking on a mission, one that pulls us away from the usual territory of, let's say, conventional warfare. We're heading straight into the shadow history of espionage.
Yeah, we're not really talking about missiles or submarines today. Not in the way you'd normally think, anyway.
No, exactly. Our dive today is into something else entirely. It's about the decades-long, often classified search by U.S. intelligence agencies to weaponize human consciousness,
Yeah.
human perception itself.
That's right. And you really have to see it in the Cold War context. I mean, the US and the USSR, they were locked in this intense zero-sum game. It pushed both sides to explore some really unconventional fields, things most scientists back then considered, well, deeply controversial, maybe even supernatural.
Things like ESP, extrasensory perception, psychokinesis.
Exactly. And specifically, remote viewing. The official U.S. programs, they started up in the early 70s, mainly under the DIA and the CIA.
Hmm.
Eventually, this evolved into what became known as Project Stargate, formally established around 1972.
Okay, so our mission today, for you listening, is to try and get past the sensational stuff, the headlines. We need to unpack the actual evidence. Look at the methods they use, some of which produced genuinely, well, stunning results. And we also have to confront the really difficult, staggering ethical questions that come up when the U.S. military spends 2 decades exploring the potential of the human mind like this.
Yeah, it's about assessing the signal, finding the real substance amidst all the noise and speculation.
Right. Sorting the signal from the noise.
And finding that signal, well, it means starting small, quite literally, in fact.
Right.
The whole U.S. program really traces its roots back to the Stanford Research Institute, SRI. That's where the CIA first kicked off the pilot remote viewing program, or RV, as they called it.
Yeah, and what's so interesting about that starting point is just how almost accidental it seems.
Mm.
The CIA was basically trying to check out these persistent, sometimes really strange claims coming out of the Soviet Union about their own psychic research. So they hired these early researchers, people like Ingo Swann, essentially just to see if they could replicate anything under controlled conditions.
And the famous story, the anecdote that really got things moving, involved Swan. They started with really simple tests, hide something in a box or an envelope, and the viewer tries to describe it.
Okay, basic stuff.
Right. But what really accelerated things was one particular trial, one specific hit involving a hidden object.
Ah, the moth story.
That's the one.
Yeah.
Swan described it. He said, and I'm quoting here, "I see something small, brown, and irregular, sort of like a leaf or something that resembles it, except that it seems very much alive, like it's even moving."
And the target was?
It was a small, live moth, just sitting there, and it genuinely did look, apparently startlingly, like a dried-up leaf.
Wow. Okay, so that one anecdote, that one hit, that was enough.
Yeah. It provided enough, let's say, immediate validation that the CIA decided, okay, maybe there's something here worth a more serious, structured look. That's when the pilot study, the Biofield Measurements Program, got formally funded. Just under $50,000, $49,909 to be exact.
Not a huge amount, but significant.
Right. It marked the shift from just investigating odd claims to trying to conduct a genuine scientific inquiry. They brought in physicists like Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff to help design the experiments.
Okay, so they've got this initial validation, this moth incident. The next big challenge must have been rigor, right? How do you go from a moth in a box to something that could actually stand up to scientific scrutiny and eventually maybe even be useful for intelligence gathering?
That was exactly the problem. They immediately moved on from, symbols and envelopes. They started trying to remote view actual locations, local target sites around the San Francisco Bay Area. And the key was the protocol. The people who actually went out to the site, the outbound experimenters, they operated under really strict rules, designed specifically to eliminate any possibility of cueing the viewer.
Right, you couldn't have them accidentally giving hints.
No way. They had to prevent what they called artifactual matching. That's the idea that the viewer might just be guessing based on some subtle, maybe even unconscious cue. And later, the results weren't judged by the experimenters themselves. They used independent third-party judges working under double-blind conditions. Nobody involved in the judging knew what the actual target was for any given session.
Total separation. And did this rigorous approach actually work? Did they get results?
They did. And importantly, they maintained that this kind of remote viewing using these protocols was successfully replicated in other independent labs. That lent considerable scientific weight, suggesting it wasn't just some fluke happening at SRI. It pointed towards a real phenomenon.
Interesting.
And they also discovered pretty quickly that this ability, whatever it was, wasn't limited to just a few special individuals. Lots of different people could demonstrate high quality remote viewing. Often they were completely surprised
Like
themselves.
Hella Hamid, the photographer.
Exactly like Hella Hamid. She was initially quite skeptical, but turned out to be a very adept viewer. It suggested the potential might be more widespread.
But okay, scientific replication is one thing. Getting institutional buy-in from somewhere like the CIA, that's another challenge altogether.
Yeah.
What was the real turning point that kept the program alive?
You're right, it wasn't just the data. The crucial moment, the thing that gave the program real institutional life, came when they managed to convince the most skeptical people in the room,
Who were?
the CIA's own contract monitors.
Uh, the guy sent to watch over the program.
Precisely. This detail often gets lost, but it's critical. These monitors were there initially as watchdogs, highly critical. Their job was basically to scrutinize everything, find flaws, find fraud, poor methods, ideally to shut it down if it wasn't legitimate.
Standard oversight.
But the researchers, Targ and Puthoff, they made a really smart move. A bit risky, maybe. They asked the critics to actually participate in the experiments.
Wait, you're saying the spies, the monitors, became the psychics?
Essentially, yes, for a time. In one formal series, they ran 55 remote viewing trials, and 3 visiting CIA personnel, they were designated V1, V2, and V3. In the reports, they actually contributed 7 of those viewings.
So they were doing the very task they were supposed to be critiquing.
Exactly. Talk about putting your money where your mouth is.
And were the results any good? Did it convince them?
It seems it did, absolutely. One of the most famous examples involved V1, one of the monitors. He produced a sketch and a description that was apparently strikingly accurate for the target he was assigned. The target turned out to be a local merry-go-round.
The merry-go-round, okay.
Yeah, and the sheer quality of the data, especially coming from someone with 0 prior exposure to this, no belief in it, it was incredibly persuasive for the people involved.
So the CIA's own final report on that phase had to acknowledge this, didn't it?
Right.
They couldn't ignore data from their own monitors.
Right. The conclusion in the report was pretty powerful because of that. It explicitly noted that visiting CIA personnel, quote, with no previous exposure to such concepts have performed well under controlled laboratory conditions. For the monitors who went through it, that seems to have been definitive. They basically concluded, okay, there is something to this remote viewing thing. It was real enough, apparently, to warrant the agency's continued attention.
And that attention naturally shifted pretty quickly towards high-stakes intelligence targets, didn't it? Once you convince the internal critics, you probably stop looking at merry-go-rounds and start looking at, say, things behind the Iron Curtain.
That's exactly what happened. Which leads us to one of the most talked about operational tasks, the Soviet Union's nuclear testing site at Semipalatinsk.
Okay, this was a real intelligence target. High priority, highly sensitive.
Absolutely, a genuine operational tasking. The goal was simple. Get any data possible on this incredibly secure Soviet facility. And even in the very early phase, Phase I, which was really just about calibrating, trying to see if they could even acquire the target mentally, the viewer described something very specific and unusual, a multi-story crane, like a gantry crane.
Not something you just guess.
Probably not. And that was taken as a really crucial indicator. If the viewer could correctly identify such a specific, non-generic piece of industrial equipment at the site, it strongly suggested they had achieved genuine target acquisition, that they were actually seeing the right place.
Okay, so that gets their attention. Then the program moved into more intense phases, right? For verification.
Yes. Phase 2 is about generating specific physical data about the site, things that could potentially be checked against other intelligence sources, like satellite imagery or maybe reports from human agents. Cross-correlation, essentially.
Trying to verify the psychic data with known facts.
Exactly. But
Okay.
phase three was the real deep end. That involved tasking the viewers to generate unverifiable data, information that was purely of operational interest to the client, the intelligence agency requesting it, things they couldn't confirm immediately, maybe couldn't confirm ever, but that might inform their long-term understanding or strategy regarding the site.
So what was the final verdict on the Semipalatinsk data? Did it prove useful?
Well, the sponsor's assessment, the agency that requested the viewing, they acknowledged there was definitely noise along with the signal. RV data is inherently messy, it seems. But they also confirmed that the viewer did correctly describe specific large structural elements at the site. and some critical technical details about the facility's operations.
And crucially,
Crucially, they stated the information appeared to dovetail with data from other sources, meaning it didn't contradict and in some ways seemed to corroborate intelligence they already had from more conventional means.
so it wasn't maybe the primary source, but it offered a valuable cross-check. Another angle,
That seems to be how they viewed it, an additional unconventional input stream.
which highlights something important. The main goal of a lot of this SRI work wasn't just spying on the Soviets. It was also about threat assessment, wasn't it? They needed to figure out if others, particularly the Soviets, could potentially use these same techniques against the U.S.
Absolutely, that was a huge driver. So they spent a lot of time tasking viewers against U.S. facilities or activities where the ground truth reality was a priori known, as the reports put it.
Known targets, basically.
Right. Things like timing U.S. rocket launches or viewing underground nuclear tests in Nevada, they knew the answers already. It was about refining their methods, understanding the capabilities and limitations, and proving its potential viability if used by an adversary.
And probably the highest profile example of this kind of threat assessment having potential policy implications came during the Carter administration, concerning the proposed mobile MX missile system.
Ah, yes, the MX missile scenario. That's a fascinating case study.
Let's unpack that a bit, because it really shows how this, well, frankly, strange research could intersect directly with major strategic policy decisions.
Okay, so the whole debate around the MX missile system was about survivability. How do you protect your most powerful nuclear missiles from a potential Soviet first strike? The plan, the mobile basing concept, involved building thousands of hardened silos but only deploying a few hundred missiles among them.
The shell game.
Exactly. A massive, incredibly expensive nuclear shell game. The idea was to constantly shuffle the missiles randomly between all these silos, so the Soviets could never know exactly which silos held the actual missiles at any given moment. This uncertainty was supposed to guarantee deterrence.
Okay, makes sense on paper. And the SRI researchers were asked to use remote viewing to test this core assumption.
That's right. Could an adversary, theoretically using psychic means, figure out which silos held the missiles? Defeat the shell game. They combined the raw RV data with a very sophisticated statistical technique. It's called sequential sampling.
Sequential sampling, what does that do?
Think of it like this. It's a way to update your confidence level about something with each new piece of information you get. You keep sampling, in this case, getting RV impressions, until you reach a predetermined level of statistical certainty. Then you stop. It's efficient.
Okay.
And when they processed the RV data using this sequential sampling method, the results were apparently pretty forceful. They showed that, at least in principle, an adversary could potentially defeat the mobile basing system. They could, theoretically, locate the randomly shuffled missiles with enough accuracy to negate the whole strategy.
Wow. Okay, so a perceived psychic threat, potentially undermining a multi-billion-dollar strategic defense system. That's quite something.
It is. The results were briefed to the appropriate government offices, circulated quite widely within the defense and intelligence communities. Now, the exact role that this RV data played in the ultimate decision to cancel the mobile version of the MX missile, that's debated. It's hard to know for sure.
Sure, policy decisions are complex.
Right. But it definitely served as a key prototypical example of how this unusual intelligence stream could generate findings with potentially profound policy implications. It got people's attention at very high levels.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about some operational tasking, some successes, the policy implications. Let's dive into the mechanics. How do they actually do this? Achieving that kind of claimed accuracy, even inconsistently, on a target like Semipalatinsk, that surely required more than just sitting down and, hoping for psychic vibes. It must have involved structured training, specific techniques.
Oh, absolutely. You need a framework. We should probably start with the basic definition they used. Remote viewing, or RV, was defined as seeking impressions about a distant or unseen target using paranormal means, in particular, extrasensory perception, ESP, that's the formal definition.
Seeking impressions, okay.
And within the U.S. military program, specifically Project Stargate and its predecessors, several distinct methodologies emerged. They were all trying different ways to channel that raw ESP, that raw perception, into something usable, into actual data.
Yeah. And the main one was CRV. Controlled remote viewing.
Yes, CRV was arguably the cornerstone, developed largely by Ingo Swann at SRI.
What does the controlled part mean? It sounds very rigorous, very disciplined.
It is, extremely. The term control here refers specifically to imposing analytical discipline on what is fundamentally non-rational, often messy sensory input. A CRV session is highly structured, almost like a ritual in a way. The viewer typically sits at a table with paper and pen. They move through distinct stages following a strict protocol.
Stages like what?
Well, they might start with just basic ideograms, quick sketches, trying to capture the fundamental energy or gestalt of the site. Like, is it angular? Is it rounded? Is there verticality? Then they move into describing basic sensory data textures, colors, sounds, smells, tastes, temperatures, then into dimensions, shapes, geometry, and only much later, after laying down all this raw data, do they start trying to piece it together into higher level concepts. The discipline is all about preventing the viewer from jumping to conclusions, from guessing too early.
Keeping the analytic overlay, the guessing part, suppressed as long as possible.
Exactly. Keep the logical brain out of it until the raw data is on the page.
Okay, that very rigid, structured approach seems quite different from the next major methodology they developed, ERV, or extended remote viewing.
Yeah, ERV is quite different. It was pioneered largely by Skip Atwater, who became the operations and training officer for the Stargate unit in the 1980s. ERV was more of a hybrid approach. It moved away from the table, the pen and paper, the rigid structure. It aimed for a more altered state of consciousness.
How do they try to achieve that?
Often the viewer would actually lie down, maybe on a bed or a comfortable recliner, usually in a darkened, quiet room. And crucially, they often utilized specialized audio technology.
You mean the hemisync tapes from the Monroe Institute?
Precisely. Hemisync uses binaural beats playing slightly different sound frequencies into each ear through headphones. The brain tries to reconcile these, and it's believed to induce specific brainwave states. The goal was to get the viewer into a deeply relaxed state, somewhere between wakefulness and sleep, sometimes called the hypnagogic state. The idea was to bypass the critical logical mind more completely, allowing that raw, non-local data to just flow more freely without the structure of CRV.
So you have the very analytical, structured CRV versus the more relaxed, immersive, sound-assisted ERV.
Yeah.
Two different paths to the same goal.
Right. And then there was a third main technique, which had a very different purpose. It wasn't really about describing a place. That's ARV, or associational remote viewing.
ARV. And that was used for prediction.
Purely for prediction, yes.
Right.
Instead of trying to describe, say, the crane at Semipalatinsk, you'd use RV to try and forecast a future binary outcome. Will the stock market go up or down tomorrow? Who will win the football game? That kind of thing.
How does that work? How do you view a future event?
You don't view the event directly. The key is the association part. Before the event, you associate two completely different, distinct physical objects, or photos, these are your targets, with the two possible outcomes. For example, you might decide, if the market goes up, the target photo is a picture of an observatory. If the market goes down, the target photo is a picture of a starfish.
Okay.
These are chosen randomly, kept hidden.
Okay.
Then the remote viewer is tasked to describe the target photo associated with the actual outcome, which is still in the future. They don't know the associations, they just describe what they see. If they accurately describe the observatory photo, your prediction is for an up market. If they describe the starfish, you predict a down market. You make the prediction based on which pre-associated target they successfully viewed.
Huh. That's clever. Using RV to get information about a proxy target that's linked to a future outcome.
It's a way around the complexities of viewing something that hasn't happened yet.
Okay, so they had these different methods, CRV, ERV, ARV. But despite all that structure, the fundamental problem seems to be the nature of the data itself, right? You said RV is remote perception, not just remote viewing. What does that mean in practice?
It means the information coming through isn't just visual. It's often described as staticky or spotty. Like watching a movie clip where the scenes are out of order, maybe the sound doesn't match the picture, or bits are missing. Not congruent is a phrase they use.
So the challenge isn't just receiving the signal, it's interpreting it correctly.
Absolutely. Interpretation is probably the hardest part. The raw data is this messy jumble of impressions. Non-visual stuff is huge: feelings, emotions, a sense of energy, movement, sometimes smells or sounds. It's actually much easier, apparently, for a viewer to get low-level general data. Things like, it feels cold, dark, wet, scary, feels like it's underground. That captures the kind of emotional or energetic essence of a place. What's extremely difficult is getting specific labels, like naming a street, Huntington Boulevard, or reading a sign. Because those labels, those words, they contain enormous amounts of complex, culturally specific data. That kind of high-level information is just very hard to pull accurately across distance and potentially time.
So paradoxically, when a viewer gets a really clear, easy label, like reading a specific word that might actually be a red flag, a sign that they're guessing.
Very often, yes. That's usually the analytic overlay kicking in. The viewer's logical brain sees a dark shape in the water and jumps to, oh, that must be a submarine. That leap, that guess, which is often fueled by the desire to be successful, to get the right answer.
Yeah.
That's usually where the errors come in.
Which brings us to Joe McMonigle. He was viewer 001 for the military unit, right? For Stargate. And he's been quite frank about the program's limitations over the years. If this technique was so potentially revolutionary, how reliable was it actually in practice?
McMonigle's assessment is pretty sober, yeah. He stated that operational remote viewing, outside of very specialized lab conditions, rarely exceeds about 65% reliability. He famously said, quote, "If it sounds too good to be true, it is."
65% accuracy. For intelligence work, that still means it's wrong more than a third of the time. How did the military justify funding that?
Well, you have to think about the targets. For many intelligence targets, especially black targets where you have no other information, getting any data, even if it's only 65% reliable, could be incredibly valuable, especially as we saw with Semipalatinsk. If that data seemed to dovetail or correlate with hints from other intelligence sources, it was seen as an indicator, a potential lead, maybe a cross-check, not necessarily definitive proof on its own.
Okay, so value in specific contexts. But McMonigle's biggest warning wasn't really about the technical accuracy, was it? It was more psychological.
Right, the famous idea about the ego.
The ego being the enemy of good remote view.
Yes, he really stressed this point, that the competitive ego, the part of us that wants to be right, wants to impress, wants to be on top, be the best viewer, is fundamentally counterproductive in RV. That ego is what drives the viewer to guess, to interpret too quickly, to force an answer when the data is unclear.
Because the real process requires.
It requires allowing that raw, often messy, sometimes confusing original thought or perception to just emerge, without judgment, without forcing it into a neat box immediately. You could argue the whole discipline of CRV, with its rigid stages, was designed precisely to manage the ego, to force the viewer to report the raw geometry, the textures, the colors, before allowing the ego to jump in and slap a label on it.
It's fascinating, too, how many practitioners describe the experience of remote viewing itself. Some accounts sound incredibly physical, almost immersive.
Yes, that comes up a lot. Many describe it as feeling exactly like being physically present at the target location, or like teleporting there. They report distinct physical sensations, smells, sounds, sometimes even a feeling of motion.
Which supports the idea that maybe this isn't just a purely mental exercise, that the body is involved somehow.
That's a common theme. And often, people involved in these programs reported spontaneous psychic-like experiences before any formal training, like Skip Atwater mentioning childhood out-of-body states, or others reporting uncanny premonitions, like seeing a relative's death before it happened.
So the implication is maybe this ability isn't something you learn from scratch. Maybe it's more like an inherent potential that you learn to access or remember and then enhance.
That's the belief among many proponents, that the ability is inherent, maybe latent in everyone to some degree, and that practices which increase self-awareness, things like meditation, mindfulness, just paying attention to your body, can enhance it. There's this idea of the body as a kind of representation of the mind. If you can calm the mind, you calm the body, and maybe that opens up the filter, allows you to perceive these non-local signals more clearly. Controlling the body helps control the psychic static, maybe.
And if we look at the bigger picture, the potential mechanism behind all this, many people involved in RV, especially the physicists, started pointing towards quantum physics, didn't they? Trying to find a scientific explanation.
They did. Quantum non-locality is often cited. It's a complex idea, but the gist is that quantum mechanics seems to allow for connections or correlations between particles instantly, regardless of the distance separating them. Faster than light communication, essentially, which classical physics forbids.
So the idea is if information, or maybe even consciousness itself, is fundamentally non-local.
Meaning it isn't confined to one point in space or time, but exists potentially everywhere simultaneously, then that could provide a theoretical framework for how someone could perceive information from a distant location. It fits with that everywhere, everyone feeling that practitioners sometimes report during deep RV states. It challenges our basic assumptions about space, time, and information.
Okay, let's bring it back to the operational side. These high-stakes viewings kept the funding flowing despite the controversies. Joe McMonigle, RV-001, he wasn't just viewing cranes or checking U.S. tests. His targets included things like classified Soviet submarines, right?
Yeah.
And monitoring the American hostages in Tehran during the Iran hostage crisis.
That's correct. He reportedly monitored the hostages for 14 months, providing ongoing information about their health, welfare, and location information, presumably valued by intelligence agencies during that incredibly tense period.
But arguably the most, well, audacious tasking he received was the one to view Mars.
Yes, the Mars viewing, tasked specifically for the time frame of 1 million years BC. I mean, the target description alone really pushes the boundaries of what you typically think of as military intelligence gathering.
Definitely ventures into high strangeness. So what did McMonigle report seeing on Mars, supposedly a million years ago?
He described seeing structures, things like an old fort, pyramids, and apparently a road, a very long road, running for over 1,000 kilometers that went straight through a massive impact crater. He perceived that the crater itself seemed to have been deliberately modified, engineered somehow, to allow this road to pass through it seamlessly.
Okay, that sounds like something straight out of science fiction. Did he make any attempt to, verify this perception? How could you?
Well, after the viewing session, he apparently went to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL. He had generated specific geographic coordinates for the features he saw during the session. He requested satellite imagery or data for those specific coordinates on Mars. The story goes that when he handed the location card to a staff member there, the person looked at it and said something like, "Oh, that's the old city on Mars. That's the account." He received packets of data, including negatives, which, when enlarged, apparently confirmed the features he had described. Based on the imagery, he even tried to estimate the size of one object, maybe a pyramid, maybe something else he called a shard, suggesting it was tens of thousands of feet tall. And crucially, he concluded it must have been constructed after the giant impact event occurred.
That's mind-bending, if true. And this venturing into high strangeness wasn't just McMonigle or just Mars, was it? Other early pioneers in the program, like Pat Price and Ingo Swann, were also reportedly tasked with targets described as anomalous or even otherworldly.
Yes, there seems to have been an undercurrent of interest in these more fringe topics right from the early days. And we see that focus on the anomalous continuing, extending into more contemporary subjects like UAPs, unidentified anomalous phenomena.
I mean UFOs, basically.
Right. For example, some remote viewers, like Daz Smith, who publishes his work openly, have targeted specific, well-documented UAP events, like the famous 2004 USS Nimitz Tic Tac encounter.
And what did Smith perceive about the Tic Tac?
His reported perceptions seem to mirror the accounts from the Navy pilots quite closely. Incredible speed, erratic, non-ballistic movements. But he also noted something interesting. The object seemed to become non-physical at times, almost like it was phasing in and out of our observable reality somehow.
Which could explain some of the bizarre flight characteristics the pilots reported. Did he perceive who or what was controlling it?
That's another fascinating point. Smith reported perceiving no life forms associated with the Tic Tac object itself, no pilots, no occupants, which led him to speculate that maybe it wasn't a piloted craft in the traditional sense, but perhaps some kind of extremely advanced drone or probe.
Interesting. These kinds of viewings, Mars, UAPs, they really highlight how the military's interest in the unconventional wasn't just limited to passive perception, gathering data on known targets.
Exactly. The move from trying to get high accuracy data on Soviet cranes or U.S. missile silos to tasking viewers against ancient Mars or contemporary UAPs, it represents a significant ideological shift, doesn't it? A growing belief, perhaps, in the sheer power and reach of the mind.
And that belief seems to have really peaked under one particular figure, General Albert Stubblebine III.
Ah, General Stubblebine. Yes, if you want to understand the leap from a disciplined, if controversial, psychic spy program into the truly bizarre fringes of mind-over-matter experiments, Stubblebine is the key figure.
He was the chief of U.S. Army intelligence for a time, right? And he was deeply invested in this stuff.
Deeply. He wasn't just interested in remote viewing. He wanted to push way beyond that. Into psychokinesis, the idea of the mind directly affecting matter. He had visions of creating super soldiers.
Super soldiers who could do what?
Things like manipulate time, heal themselves or others psychically, maybe even become invisible or famously walk through walls. He seemed to genuinely believe these things were achievable through mental training and force of will.
Which led to perhaps the most infamous anecdote associated with him, his own reported attempt to physically walk through his office wall.
Yes. And he failed, of course. But that image, the head of Army intelligence trying to phase through solid matter, it perfectly encapsulates that ideological leap. You go from the relatively controlled, data-gathering focus of early RV to this uncontrolled, almost desperate desire to violate the known laws of physics through sheer mental effort.
And despite the, let's say, skepticism Stubblebine must have faced, especially after that wall incident, these ideas didn't just vanish, did they? They led to things like the secret goat lab.
That's right. Even though reports suggest high-ranking commanders at places like Fort Bragg were, perhaps understandably, not very interested in funding research into psychically harming animals. Elements within the Special Forces apparently went ahead and secretly ran experiments based on Stubblebine's more out-there theories.
And this involved the goat staring.
Yes. It involved a civilian contractor named Guy Savelli, who practiced this very peculiar technique, essentially intensely staring at goats with the intention of causing them harm or stopping their hearts.
Seriously, so staring goats to death.
Well, the stated goal was often just to cause them to drop or collapse, using only focused mental intent. Savelli himself openly talked about how difficult it was to maintain the required level of concentration, and he recounted, quite matter-of-factly, the accidental death of one goat during what he described as a failed attempt where his focus wavered. He also claimed he had successfully killed a smaller animal, a hamster, using the same focused staring method previously.
That's disturbing.
Yeah.
And ethically incredibly questionable.
Absolutely. It's a stark example of how far into morally gray, even dark territory this research strayed once it moved away from the relatively controlled protocols of the SRI lab and into these more fringe, results-oriented military experiments.
And then, after the official military program Project Stargate was finally shut down in 1995, we saw some of the figures involved, like Major Ed Dames, who was one of the military psychic spies, move into the private sector, didn't we?
Yes, Dames and others became public figures, often sensationalizing their experiences, writing books, offering training.
Which probably helped create this public image of intrigue and mystery around psychic spying, but maybe also added a lot more noise and skepticism to the mix.
Definitely. It blurred the lines between the documented, if controversial, government research and the more outlandish claims made in the private sector afterwards.
Okay, let's shift now to the kind of resistance these programs faced while they were running.
Yeah.
It wasn't all smooth sailing, even internally.
Oh, far from it. The scientific resistance, the social resistance, even institutional resistance within the military and intelligence communities themselves, it was immense and constant. You see the paradox perfectly in how they struggled just to get the semi-politics data analyzed objectively. They apparently had trouble finding an unbiased third party willing to even look at the results simply because of where the data came from remote viewing.
Why? What were the objections?
They ran into opposite extremes. One potential analysis group reportedly declined because they considered the whole concept unscientific nonsense, just garbage data not worth their time. But then a second group also declined, apparently because they were concerned the results were too good and might be possibly demonic in origin.
Wow. Caught between scientific materialism and, well, superstition.
Right.
Unable to find anyone willing to just analyze the data on its merits.
Exactly. It made getting consistent institutional commitment incredibly difficult. The CIA's own later reviews concluded the program management itself was controversial throughout its history. Statistical analysis became the main battleground. You had highly respected statisticians like Professor Jessica Utz from UC Davis, looking at the accumulated data from decades of experiments and concluding there was statistically significant evidence for psi effects, for psychic phenomena, real effects.
But others disagreed.
Strongly. You had other equally prominent experts, like Ray Hyman, another psychologist and statistician, looking at the same data and arguing it was flawed, maybe due to subtle methodological errors or statistical manipulation, or just wishful thinking. He basically called it, all BS.
So when your top experts are diametrically opposed,
the bureaucracy tends to get nervous and retreat. It becomes very hard to justify continued funding for something so fundamentally contested, no matter how intriguing some results might be.
and alongside the methodological debates, there was always that underlying threat perception, wasn't there? The concern wasn't just if RV worked, but could hostile groups use it effectively against the U.S., the psychic terrorism angle.
That was a constant worry, yes. And the sources mentioned several instances where Stargate remote viewers apparently did pick up on genuine potential threats during operational sessions. Things like spotting stolen vehicles potentially meant for illicit use, or hidden caches of automatic weapons, or detecting hostile surveillance against U.S. personnel.
But this information was ignored.
Often, yes. Reportedly ignored by the relevant officials or field units, precisely because the information came from this unconventional, unproven source. The fear within the Stargate unit was, If the U.S. couldn't even trust or act on its own successful RV intelligence, what if an adversary figured out how to use it more effectively and didn't have the same institutional skepticism?
That blend of conventional intelligence work and these, well, supernatural insights, as some saw them, it seems to have bled over directly into the world of psychological operations or psyops.
Yes, there's a definite crossover. And sometimes unconventional research led to surprisingly practical, if strange, outcomes, like Colonel John Alexander's infamous sticky foam.
Sticky foam, what was that?
It was developed as a non-lethal weapon, a chemical foam that could be sprayed on people to immobilize them, basically stick them in place, stick them to walls or floors without causing permanent injury.
Okay, a bit weird. And they came from paranormal research.
Apparently, yes. The initial concept or chemistry was derived from some early tests related to paranormal phenomena back in the 1970s. It found this very practical, albeit unusual, non-lethal application decades later, probably without anyone using it knowing its bizarre origins.
And Alexander himself, who's involved in some of this unconventional research, he had a very particular view of warfare, didn't he? He advocated moving away from traditional killing or destruction.
He did. His core philosophy, as he articulated it, was about modifying the adversary's beliefs and perspectives. He saw the ultimate goal not as conquest, but as influence, finding an unfulfilled need on the adversary side and linking it somehow to a behavior we desired. It's warfare conducted almost entirely in the psychological realm, aiming for compliance, for changed minds, rather than just destruction.
Which brings us to a really troubling aspect of modern psyops, where the mind itself becomes the direct target, the documented use of music in interrogations.
Yes, this emerged particularly in the context of the War on Terror. There were numerous reports from detainees, from interrogators, about the use of music often played repetitively at high volumes for extended periods.
And the type of music was sometimes surprisingly mundane,
Yeah.
not necessarily overtly aggressive.
Right. Detainees reported being subjected to things that seemed almost benign on the surface. Covers of Fleetwood Mac songs, tracks by Matchbox 20, not exactly death metal.
So what was the purpose? If it wasn't just about sonic pain, what was the psychological goal?
Well, there seem to be conflicting perspectives presented in the source materials on this. One perspective suggested, maybe somewhat defensively, that using music was actually a softer tactic to, quote, lighten the environment, maybe give these people some comfort instead of beating them to death. The implication being it was used to induce fatigue, maybe break down resistance, promote compliance through psychological wear down rather than physical abuse.
But there's another side of that coin, isn't there? A more overtly weaponized view of sound.
Definitely. Other reports from around the same time listed various acoustic weapons concepts that were under serious consideration or development by the military. Things like infrasound, low-frequency sound that can cause physical effects like nausea, disorientation, bowel disruption, and even something explicitly called a psychocorrection device designed for subliminal influence on behavior.
Okay, that's much darker. That suggests a very deliberate long-term military interest in sound and music, not just as an annoyance, but as a tool for manipulating the mind and body directly. It really blurs the line between comfort and coercion, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It points to the mind itself being viewed as a battle space, a target to be influenced or controlled.
And the inherent darkness in some of these psychological tactics. Perhaps it's most vividly embodied by the situation that unfolded at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, the site of horrific detainee abuse.
Yes. One soldier who worked night shifts there, Joseph Curtis, gave a really striking description. He compared the prison building itself to the Overlook Hotel from Stephen King's novel The Shining. He said the place felt haunted.
Haunted not by ghosts, presumably, but by something else.
Exactly. He wasn't talking about literal ghosts. He felt the building itself, because of its history of torture and death under Saddam Hussein, somehow wanted to be back in business. His perspective suggested that the environment itself, the very place, was toxic, that it contributed to bringing out the beast in man, fostering the kind of psychological breakdown that led to the abuses. It shifts the focus slightly from just individual bad apples to maybe a systemic or environmental influence.
And General Stubblebine, the same general interested in walking through walls and goat labs, he actually weighed in on the Abu Ghraib controversy too, didn't he? linking it back to PSYOPs.
He did. He controversially suggested that the inhumane acts committed at Abu Ghraib, the humiliation, the sexual degradation, the photos were perhaps not just spontaneous cruelty by low-ranking soldiers. He proposed they might have been orchestrated, or at least encouraged, by intelligence communities for specific PSYOPs purposes.
What purpose?
To inflict maximum psychological distress on the detainees, certainly, but also maybe to send a broader message to the wider enemy population. A message of dominance, degradation, and the complete vulnerability of those who oppose the U.S.
That narrative paints the abuse not as a failure of discipline, but as a calculated psychological strategy. Aligned perhaps with Colonel Alexander's philosophy of using psychological impact as a primary weapon, it's a truly chilling interpretation.
It is. It suggests a potential synthesis of unconventional research into the mind's vulnerabilities and actual battlefield strategy with devastating human consequences.
And finally, when we talk about human cost and ethical boundaries, we really have to touch on the tragic story of Frank Olson and his son Eric's decades-long quest for answers.
Yes, the Frank Olson case is haunting. His death in 1953 became deeply entangled with the CIA's early top-secret experimentation with mind-altering drugs, specifically LSD under programs like MKUltra.
They were exploring LSD for brainwashing, mind control interrogation.
Exactly. And Frank Olson, an Army biochemist working on bioweapons defense, was apparently dosed with LSD without his knowledge or consent. Days later, he fell to his death from a hotel window in New York City. Officially ruled a suicide, but the circumstances have always been deeply suspicious.
And his son, Eric Olson, has spent most of his life trying to uncover the full truth. He even returned to their old family home in Frederick, Maryland.
Yes, and the account mentions the house remained almost entirely unchanged since 1953, like a time capsule, serving as this silent physical symbol of the unresolved trauma, the secrecy, the institutional betrayal surrounding his father's death.
And Eric has expressed this deep frustration, hasn't he? That his father's life, his work, his suspicious death, all intertwined with these secret government programs of profound ethical violations, has been sort of reduced over the decades to just a sensational narrative, a conspiracy theory footnote.
It really underscores a crucial point, I think. Behind all the classified project names, Stargate, Grill Flame, MKUltra, behind the statistics, the debates about methodology, the sensational stories of psychic spies, there's often immense real human suffering, families destroyed, lives ruined, institutional failures with devastating personal consequences, the relentless drive to understand and maybe weaponize the mind. It clearly led intelligence agencies down some very dark paths, with ethical violations that continue to cast long shadows today.
Okay, so let's try to pull all these threads together now. We've covered a really remarkable, almost schizophrenic dual history here, haven't we? On one side, you have these documented, seemingly successful, sometimes validated remote viewing experiments conducted under rigorous double-blind protocols. You have the Moth incident, the CIA monitors getting results, the description of the semi-Paladin's crane, the MX missile threat assessment, things that suggest something real was happening.
Right. Tangible results, at least sometimes, under controlled conditions.
But then, on the other side, you have the far more speculative, ethically murky, sometimes downright bizarre corners of this research. The push into mind control, psychic warfare fantasies, the general trying to walk through walls, the secret goat lab experiments, the disturbing psychological applications hinted at in PSYOPs and Abu Ghraib.
It really is the ultimate paradox, isn't it? The core program, Stargate and its predecessors, it persisted for over 2 decades. Under various names, with significant funding at times, it survived because enough evidence accumulated, often backed by credible statistical analysis, to suggest a genuine, if perhaps limited and unreliable, human capability was being demonstrated.
But it was never definitive enough.
Never definitive enough to overcome the skepticism, the inability to fully quantify it, to consistently replicate it on demand, to integrate it neatly into the existing scientific materialist framework. It meant that charlatans, sensationalizers, and legitimate critics could always find ammunition. They existed right alongside the genuine, rigorous scientific research that was also happening. The signal, the potentially real phenomenon, was constantly getting drowned out by all the surrounding noise, but the argument from proponents is the signal was demonstrably there, however faint or intermittent.
And that signal, those proponents argue, it fundamentally challenges scientific materialism itself. It forces us to at least consider these more out-there ideas like quantum non-locality as potential explanations for how information might be accessed beyond normal sensory channels.
Which brings us towards a kind of core philosophical conclusion that maybe Project Stargate, perhaps completely unintentionally, stumbled upon. Maybe consciousness isn't just some accidental byproduct of complex brain chemistry. Maybe it's something more fundamental to the universe itself.
A primary property, not just an emergent one.
Possibly. And if that's even remotely true, then maybe the old, rigid dogmas of classical science and some of the long dismissed ideas from spiritual or mystical traditions, maybe they aren't so incompatible after all. Maybe they're actually starting to converge in unexpected ways.
Which loops us right back to Joe McMonigle, RV001, and his crucial warning about the ego. He defined the ego as that competitive part of us, the need to be on top, to be the best, to be right. And he insisted that this drive, this need to force an interpretation onto ambiguous data, is fundamentally counterproductive, not just for remote viewing, but for accessing any kind of creative, original, intuitive thought.
So if the single greatest limitation on our own potential psychic or intuitive capabilities, whatever you want to call them, is simply our ego's relentless need to be right, to have the answer, to conform to what we already think we know.
Then the final question we have to leave you with is this. How much collective knowledge, how much personal insight are we sacrificing every single day, simply because we prioritize the ego's comforting need for confirmation over the often difficult, messy, non-logical truth?
That difficult, maybe only 65% reliable truth, it's often much harder to grasp and certainly harder to communicate than a neat, satisfying story the ego wants to believe, even if that story is manufactured.
Something to think about. Do you primarily seek out knowledge that confirms what you already believe? Or are you willing to dedicate the time, the personal practice, maybe the discomfort required to develop your own intuition? Knowing that the results might be ambiguous, might challenge your worldview, and will likely require constant, difficult interpretation. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.